Good morning. We are almost beginning the month of July, so we're going to call humility the principle for the month since it aligns with the seventh step. And most of what my work has been based on is the freedom provided by the 12 steps in relation initially to recovery from alcohol and drugs, 35 years now. But also initially recognizing that once I had a cessation of that obsession to drink and drug, which I'd never had until I admitted that I was powerless over them. And I began to realize that what I was really powerless over was the idea that I could control and enjoy them. And as long as I maintained that idea, I fought to prove the idea was correct by drinking and using more and more and more to claim that I had control over it while I was actually functioning out of control with it. So that thinking does not go away when there is a freedom or cessation of the obsession to drink and use. The obsession itself is fundamental to a mental problem. It's actually funded as a mental problem by engaging in thoughts that are not true, thinking they're true. And that's very easy to do. And we generally call those lies, but it is often hard to have people admit that they are liars when in fact they are not liars. They are simply lying. We thinking we would be liars if thinking was who we were and who we are. But since thinking is something we do, it cannot be who we are, but simply something we think. So it's a big stretch to maintain the idea that somehow or another, simply because I think my thought that is wrong is right, or my thought that is untrue is true, all of a sudden converts into who I am is all I think. Because I think if by creating the thought that I've had that I think is real and true, all of a sudden I'm immediately engulfed by this opinion that all I am is what I think. So I fight for, on a pretty regular basis, those thoughts. Why? Because they're based on defense. They're based on a fight because they have no other basis than to oppose reality and truth. So part of what I would like to do today is to reveal how the absolute is always absolute and always available and always sharing with us, illuminating for us, exposing to us what we're doing that may not be aligned with that reality and truth in our thinking, what we're doing in our thinking, because our thinking is primary to our human capacity to function. And there are no voluntary efforts that any of us ever make that don't start with a thought. So if the thinking we're doing is corrupt, the actions we're going to take are going to be corrupted. And as a result, we're going to live in an environment that seems corrupted. And since the basis of a lie always claims not to be true, we tend to think when we are liars and we have a self based in thought that is a lie, that those thoughts happen to us and they attack us, and ego attacks us, and our brain attacks us, and all of these outside forces are conspiring against us when it's all an unwillingness to be responsible for what we're creating. So that's a brief introduction to our general discussion. The reason we have a discussion is because in my experience, when I started to come to terms with this and talked about it, it seemed like a very foreign subject to people and was very insightful, not in the INSIGHT way, but in the INCITE way. People were incited, reactive. And I noticed that talking about it actually helped me get better at noticing that what I was really talking about were thoughts, and that if I spoke to people about them as thoughts, rather than truth and reality, rather than something I was seeing in them, but something I was doing that I was seeing through, a lens through which I was seeing them, it started to make that conversation go a little bit differently and open up a little bit. Not always, but very often. And as a result, I've developed many relationships where I can have these conversations a little more openly. And some people tolerate it, I'm sure, because I tend to focus on it a lot. My experience tells me that there's no reason to be here if we're not actually interested in noticing what we're doing rather than avoiding and evading and trying to distract ourselves by coming up with other reasons to excuse ourselves, rather than become aware enough to speak to the absolute responsibility we each have for the creation of our experience. And to begin to speak in those terms is to begin to align with reality and truth, not as a being, because there is no malalignment in my being nature or our being nature, can't be maligned. The malignment comes in thinking. The maligned thoughts are the ideas that somehow or another I can divest myself of this absolute presence. I can divert myself from that absolute presence. I can conquer that absolute presence by creating what I call my own reality and my own truth, while in fact, whenever I do that, I struggle with anxiety and stress that immediately tells me there's something greater going on, because all of those byproducts of pain and emotional turmoil and inner conflict are all byproducts designed to tell me something's wrong. Now, it isn't uncommon, because of this twisted nature of our thinking being so endemic to human history, as far as I can tell from the reading I've done, the little bit of exposure that I've allowed, is that if we've been thinking this long, it seems like the only thing we can do, and the only thing that we should do, and the only thing that we have to continue doing, when in fact, it's not. And it's always something we're choosing to do where we are, how we are now, as we are now. It isn't something that is impressed on us or required of us. It's something we choose. And if it's happening, if we're getting this opinion and this anxiety and this stress that we're struggling to maintain the self we think we are, then there's some evidence that we're creating the anxiety and the stress that we seem to be struggling with. We often think of pain as confirming reality and truth because it feels so real, when in fact, as moments ago mentioned, it really is confirming that something is wrong. And there's one example of how the absolute reveals itself. There's always a clarification in our experience that is immediate to what we're thinking as to whether or not that thinking aligns with a useful, purposeful, gainful, beneficial basis, meaning substance. There is no substance in an image I project about a thought I have that claims to be true. There's no substance to it at all. It's all appearance. And so when my life becomes very concerned about how I appear, I become very conscientious about how people think about me, or very conscious of how people think about me. And my own conscientiousness begins to get crippled by this constant catering to projecting an appearance that I want to use to give people an impression about me that is simply the same impression I'm having about myself that isn't true. So it's just another corrupt extension. Lies lie, so they continue to lie. The first lie is, I think I'm only my thought, or I think my thoughts are real and true because they're conclusive. Thoughts thinking of themselves simply conclude what thoughts think. If I allow myself to believe those thoughts are true, I begin to think the entire world is based on what I think. And as a result, I become the creator of reality and truth, and thus I must be only what I think. To live that way is to fight for that thing and to see things that way, because the lie is going to tell, the lie is consistently going to, the lie I'm telling is going to consistently create new lies to justify the lie that I'm maintaining. And self-contempt is an immediate consequence of a lie. Because if who I am is not what I think I am, and who I am maintaining that I am is only born in thought, that thought is naturally contemptful because it knows it's condemned to not only a life of uncertainty and doubt, but the fact that it has no life at all other than what obsessive thoughts consistently think about it, constantly. And that's what obsession is. It's an attempt to maintain a lie. And by creating a sense of permanence, think that it's normal and think that it's the only thing I can do. And that's one of the other big lies, is that it's our only choice. Choice always allows not to be chosen, or it wouldn't be a choice. We can't be condemned to a choice. We can't have limited options. We can think they're limited because we don't want most of what they might offer. But if we're thinking we have to do something, we're condemning ourselves to what we think will happen, but very seldom does happen. And generally, the things we feel condemned to end up revealing the problems in the initial thinking by the dashed hopes and expectations of the consequences we create. The promise of a lie is a broken promise, and it will always fail. It will always reintroduce us to something we thought we were avoiding. Constantly. We're always aware. When we're willing to look honestly and see, we will see. We will be clear. When we're willing to only look at what we think, we will only see what we think, and we will only hear what we think. So seeing and hearing other people has nothing to do with them and everything to do with what we think of them. Just like seeing things have nothing to do with the things when all we're thinking about them is what we think of them. So the 7th month, 7th step, humility is the principle. Humility is, like all principles, a culmination of all the principles. It's not one separate from the others, but on the human scale, we look at them individually to ultimately see them as a collective that is loving. Because honesty, hope, faith, courage, integrity, willingness, humility, brotherly love, justice, perseverance, spiritual awareness, and service, all principles of the steps, are effectively love at the end, where service is the greatest love, the greatest giving, without expectation for return, just simply doing what we can do in the name of doing things fruitful enough to be beneficial, and what comes may. Whether people like it, whether they don't like it, whether they choose to value it, whether they choose to appreciate it, whether they choose to think that because we're doing something good for them, what they need us to do is more and more of that good thing, to the point that they do less and less of it for themselves, which is effectively enabling. And the core disease of all the diseases, the idea that I can do something more that's killing me and get better. And when people conspire in that with me, that's enabling. When I start allowing other people to have the opinion that what I am doing for them is not to help them begin doing for themselves what they can do, they become reliant on me to do for them what they're unwilling to do. And I become a conspirator in that relationship by giving them more than they've earned and deserve, simply under the pretense that I'm a big help. And it isn't helping people to do that. It isn't honest, and it isn't helpful to discourage people and to eliminate their own nobility, their own ability to be noble and accountable and responsible by providing them things they're perfectly capable of providing for themselves. And sobriety, not ironically, requires that each of us begin the process of sobriety by conceding to ourselves what the problem is. Nobody can do that for us. We get sober alone so that we can stay sober together. And emotional sobriety is seeing that all humans are participating in the mental problem if the mental problem is happening for any human. We're all part of it, not as conspirators, but as co-contributors to the problem. If I continue to get worse, I am infecting others with that same reactive, fearful nature that I am experiencing, because I'm going to act that way with them. And I'm basically reacting that way to create reactions, to distract myself and think they're the ones to blame when I'm actually the one causing those reactions to occur. So sick thinkings work off sick thoughts. Spiritual principles are all pillars of life. They're not negotiable. They're not optional. They are absolute. And consider, as your day goes, the absolute, being absolute, is always absolute, regardless of what we think of it. And what's beautiful about that, again, the absolute revealing the loving nature, is that it allows us to see the huge impact that thinking has been used to justify all of the ideas we have about other people and other things like life and love and God, that we've assigned all kinds of human characteristics to. God is somebody who gives and takes. Well, that sounds very human to me. God is somebody who holds us in contempt. Sounds very human to me. It's something I do whenever I'm maintaining thoughts that aren't true. And the inability to account for my responsibility doesn't make me irresponsible for those things. It makes me responsible for the irresponsibility I'm doing in thought, because thinking is something I do, not something I am. So to blame God and think of God as not answering my prayers and all that kind of stuff that we come up with is just another way of humanizing God and dispiriting humans. If the infinite is infinite and the absolute is absolute, and this has been discussed for thousands of years, there are no exceptions to it, and there are no options. And it has us. We don't have to get it. We don't have to perfect it. We don't have to come to terms with it. We don't even have to have faith in it for it to be what it is. And yet our human experience tends to suffer when we don't rely on things that are real and true. Just like a farmer planting seeds in midair would probably starve to death. Not a very functional use of the resources we have. If in fact this absolute nature is absolute and we do not rely on it, we are attempting to make believe that our reliance is solely based on what we think. Doesn't make us what we think. It simply gives us the impression that all we are is what we think, because pretty soon all we're doing is thinking about our thinking. And it seems that it's so consuming, and the impact of it is so dramatic and so obvious that we begin to think that's all we are. So all of the self in the old dictionaries, if you looked up self, you'd find pages of self-interpreted words associated to self that seem to have a new interpretation when you associate them to themselves, like self-made and self-help and self-love and self-esteem and self-worth and self-value. But it also includes things like self-deprecation, self-hate, self-contempt, self-loathing, self-abuse. All of these seem to take on a different context when we're dealing with the self, as though the self is something distinct from reality and truth. And words are doing their best to convey, honestly, what words mean. So if they take on another meaning, we must have been maintaining this idea about self for a long time to have all these other words associated to it as though they have some different connotation or expectation or definition. So spiritual principles are not negotiable. They do not come and go. They cannot be larger or smaller. They are not in space and time. That may seem like some highfalutin idea, but the dimensions that humans have created, the first, second, third, fourth, fifth dimension, and the others that are now perceived and are aware of, have never been divided by the dimensions that we call them. They've always been intimately interactive with all these seemingly dimensions that we've come to conclusions about. And if those include infinite realities, which they do, even within the physics realm, they recognize that there is, I believe the sixth dimension is an infinite combination of six-dimensional objects. It's starting to reveal that the infinite isn't beyond the dimensions that we're living in, but also within the dimension that we're living in. It isn't something that can't be where we are. that must always be where we are, which seems to be why whenever we're willing, whenever we're wanting, we end up seeing and realizing things that seem to be miraculous, when in fact the real miracle is that we could keep ourselves in the dread and loathing and deprecated state for so long, making believe that somehow or another that's actually true and real. That's the miracle, that we can impose this horrible experience on ourselves and others in the name of making believe that we're saving ourselves, while in fact we're killing ourselves. And that is the addiction of thought, very clearly. So spiritual principles are pillars of life. If I align myself with just that thought and begin living with that thought, considering that thought, a lot of complication starts to fall away because I have a stable basis for my thinking. I don't have to understand it to know it. I don't have to conclude it to know it. I don't have to think I have it to have it. It's just a natural state of being. And we, as beings, have bodies, which are human. And the best potential to express our being nature in that human body is to begin to notice that the being nature is primary to our existence and thinking is secondary, just like our body came well after life started. Even in that simple context, it gives some size and scope to the thinking we do and the bodies we have, rather than the being nature of our infinite existence. There is no beginning or end to that. So in our experience here, another way the absolute reveals itself is that the moments that we're witnessing, that we're always in, are always present. We're always present. We are always present. There is no thought that can take us from the present, but we can think there are. Again, thinking about thinking comes to all kinds of conclusions that aren't true. They're just self-serving thoughts. And they're really thought-serving thoughts. They're not self-serving at all. We think of them that way because we call them those things because we think there's a self that's being served by those things. And the service we're doing to that self is a disservice because it's in constant conflict with reality and truth, trying to be proven real and true by the pain we create and the anxiety and stress, and say, well, it must be real if it causes such a mess. So spiritual principles are pillars of life, whether we think it or not. And humility is having things as they are. It isn't having them larger or smaller. It's having them as they are. If you allow your thinking to begin to consider that things are always as they are, regardless of what we think of them, it begins to, again, shrink thinking down to something we're doing. And the impact of what we're doing in that thinking when we think it's right and real is a lens through which we see everything else. So we're not seeing everything else. We're only seeing what we think of everything else and everyone else. So if what we're witnessing isn't what's actually happening, that would be pretty good definition of insanity, because now we're seeing and hearing things that are limited to what we think we see and what we think we hear. So seeing and hearing things that aren't happening is a good basic definition for insanity. And it does not take a big step to entertain insane ideas. Nor does it take many more steps to become engulfed in the idea that we're not insane, while we're actually mired in the obsessive thinking that is based, my estimation, on all insanity, mental disorders, anxious disorders. Think about that word, disorders. They're out of order. We act out of order. What does that mean? Thinking is first. Reality is something we get to. God is something we have to achieve somewhere else, some other time, by doing more of something to get someplace. If the basis of the self I'm trying to fulfill has no basis, the more and more I do, the more and more I become aware that there is no fulfillment in anything that I do, but failure. And here's how the absolute reveals itself again, is that what is empty, what has no basis, is full of emptiness. If it's full of emptiness, I don't need to add shit to it to fill it up. And the idea that we are full of shit is generally something people are not that happy to imagine. But when we are wasting thought on things that have no basis. And this isn't to suggest that we cannot imagine things and that we should not fantasize about things. And that's really our inspiration to fantasize and to consider, imagine things, is fundamental to our ability to create things. And even our creation of things isn't quite creating them, because the matter we use is just a basic transformation of an existing thing. So we never create the thing, we just basically transform the thing, and our life form transforms things. We take minerals and things that were developed billions or millions of years ago and make them into something. Doesn't mean we're creating that thing. It means that we're actually just transforming the things that we've been given. We've been given everything, and what we do with it is up to us. So if this absolute nature doesn't give and take, we already have everything. There is no lack. There is no scarcity. The only lack and scarcity is in the scarce thoughts and the scarcity that I create, making believe that I'm living in a city full of fear. And that condemnation I feel, that contempt I have for others, is the condemnation I feel that I'm unwilling to accept I'm creating. So I find reasons to justify it must be everything and everyone else. So to any degree I have pitiful thoughts about other people and their lack and their wrong, I am actually admitting my wrong in seeing their lack so clearly, while obviously obscuring the responsibility I have for that vision, for that seeing. And the difference between valuing people who are giving me that perspective or giving us that perspective is the difference between saying thank you to them or fuck you to them. And that's a fairly common combination of how people break off relationships. They leave the relationship saying thank you, valuing it, appreciating the person, or saying no more. I can't take it. You're toxic. Well, my toxicity is easy to find in others when I start blaming them for what I'm doing that I don't want to admit I'm doing. So love is the basis of all principles, is like light. If you combine all colors of light that seem distinct and different to our experience, because our eyes are designed to see things in colors and shapes and sizes and articulation, all colors combined are white light. And that would be a good definition of how all principles are love, because it begins to show what seems separate in its full glory. And the only difference in the way to see that is to think of everything rather than some things. If I think in bits and pieces, I find more or less of other things I compare those bits and pieces to. If I start seeing everything, it's like the old philosophers said, if everything is changing, the one thing that doesn't change is that everything is changing. So you can't see that if you're not thinking about everything. So when I start seeing that, I start seeing that there are no distinctions between any of us, except the ones we think there are. We may have different traits, we may have different appearances on the outside, but the substance of us genetically is almost identical between all people. The variations are a fraction of a percent of difference in DNA, and all those variations are simply traits. Often physical traits, visual traits, appearance. And if who I think I am is only a thought, appearance becomes everything to me, because all I'm promoting is an appearance that has absolutely no substance whatsoever. And actually, the appearance I'm promoting has no real appearance except for my insistence and my insistence and my insistence in obsessive thinking that it's all I am, so it's all I do, and it's all I try to insist people see, while I'm creating conflict with those people and demanding of them that they begin to accept who I am and what I think for who I am. And wonder why I'm at odds with people. Can't seem to have meaningful relationships at all levels, whether it be at work, on the street, with family, with friends, etc. So humility is having things as they are. Self-deprecation is often thought of as humility, reducing ourselves, pretending we're modest when we're actually satisfied with something we've done and feel satisfied with it. Pretending we're any other way than we are. If we're wrong, we're wrong. That's humility. If we're right. That's humility. If we're in doubt, we're in doubt. That's humility. It's having things as they are. Grandiosity is humiliation. This idea that humility is humiliation, that it means we're just sorrowful, pitiful creatures needing to debase ourselves and self-deprecate ourselves to reach the level, is actually an argument in favor of recognizing the self we think we are has no value. So when we think we have no value, when we think self-worth is lacking, when we think self-esteem is lacking, when we're self-loathing, we're actually accurately assessing the loathing nature of a self we think we are that is born in contempt and hate and fear. Because it's all born in the idea that I need to come up with something to be someone rather than recognize I already am someone to even think about being anyone. So becoming someone when I already am as I am, and you are as you are, and we are as we are, is the claim we're not who we are. We must need something else to be who we are. We must need to be somewhere else to be who we are and get what we need in that place we think we need to eventually arrive. And it never seems to be enough when we get there, so we continue to perpetuate that, well, this isn't it. I need to continue to move. Need to continue to move. I need to be on the move. That chronic moving and effort is the expression of obsessive thinking, looking for a place because it has no place in reality or truth. It's simply concocted in thought. Emotional sobriety is about beginning to live sanely. Sobriety, when it comes to chemical abuse or gambling or sex or any of those things, is starting to act in relation to those things sanely. Sane would not be doing the same thing over and over again, hoping for a different result, when in fact we absolutely know the result we're going to get. That's the even greater indication of an addiction. It's not hoping we're going to get something else. It's knowing we're going to get the same thing over and over and over again because we've gotten it 1,000 times. We've had enough experience. We know where it's going to go. And to make believe we don't is just another layer of delusion trying to develop itself into reality and truth that will always create the same response, the same circumstances. Different faces, different places do not undermine or limit or eliminate the central motivation for that cause and the effects that come. So humility is having things as they are. That's beingness. It's letting things be. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. If I'm right, I'm right. If I'm in doubt, I'm in doubt. If I'm uncertain, I'm uncertain. If I'm thrilled, I'm thrilled. Begin to notice what's happening, and you'll begin to eliminate a lot of complications, because the idea that what is happening shouldn't be happening is a major conflict, because everything that is happening is always happening wherever we are. So to begin to think that my shadows of doubt, which I cast, are actually creating darkness, is living under the cloud of that darkness and making believe that's all that I am. I'm creating the image. I'm creating the narrative. I'm creating the story in my own thinking. We have great capacity to imagine, and to subvert that and think all we are is what we think is to undermine our capacity to turn that imagination into a useful, gainful, wholesome, integrated experience that we all share. And integrity, another one of the principles, is about integration. We think about it as being honest, but being honest is to see that everything is integrated. There is no variation in a seamless, infinite reality. There are no differences. Even if you consider the opposite of something infinite, it becomes infinite. If you consider a part of the infinite, it is the whole. It speaks in the exact opposite direction of the way we think on a human level. And if the primary nature of our existence is infinite and absolute, and we are subverting that, we can't subvert it, but if we think we're subverting it, we're going to live in fear and dread of being alone and being disconnected and all those feelings we have, which are accurately assessing. Again, the absolute is allowing us to see accurately what's happening. But addictive thinking thinks the thing to do about those uncomfortable thoughts, lack of self-worth and self-loathing and all that, is to get away from them, deny them, pretend they're not there, Get over them. Feel better about them. Start doing things that give me a better feeling. That's exactly what drugs and alcohol did for me. It's exactly what anything does for me that I use to distract myself, my experience, from those things. It's going to happen every time. Putting new faces and places and times on it do not change it. There again, the absolute is revealed. We can create all sorts of appearances, but it does not violate the basic premise of our absolute existence. And that basic premise of being that it's always available and it's always here and it's always accessible and it's always our experience never goes away. We just get busier and busier and busier about thinking to think that by our consumption of that thinking, consumption of thought and our intoxication with that consumption of thought actually keeps us from that other thing. So we can think we're winning the war of trying to prove the self who we think we are is real and true by constantly doing the things that actually prove it isn't. Because all of the byproducts of it, the anxiety and the stress and the disorders and all that stuff are proving these are all suicidal tendencies. They're all in some way killing us, having us compulsively interact and interreact with one another in ways that are not healthy. And we interact with the environment and interreact with the environment in that same way when we're compulsive in any other way. And I don't know anyone who has gotten sober from one thing and hasn't found other compulsions in others, because the thinking is the problem. Recovery from a symptom does not cure the addiction to thinking. And if we haven't been thinking about that, it's no wonder there are at least 150 different 12-step programs dealing with symptoms. If we're constantly trying to fix the symptom, we're constantly denying the cause of the effect that we're trying to fix. So we can talk about this, and we talk about it in some perverted manner by doing what we do obsessively on a daily basis. We're actually expressing it while we're creating a connotation of it that seems to be justified in the stories we tell that are trying to excuse our actual responsibility for the responsibility we have for the irresponsibility that we're thinking and acting on. So humility is not self-deprecation or any reduction or increase of anything. To manipulate our experience in or out of a self that we continually try to fix is to subject ourselves to the chronic nature of the disturbance over and over and over and over again. That includes the anxiety and the stress and the depression and all of those anxious disorders, our nervous system is undermined, our metabolic system is undermined, all of our bodily functions are undermined by stress, every one of them. It's an equal opportunity destroyer. It's equitable, indiscriminate, exactly like the absolute is. Interesting that the reduction of our potential actually tries to exhibit the exact same traits as the absolute nature of our existence. We find it if we look. We find all the connotations to make it look like they're true and real. Like I've got to get away from this. I got to get over this. Everything's going to be okay, but it's not now, which is basically saying that I've got to get there. I've got to do shit. I've got shit to do today. I got to get my shit together. That's a clear indication that we know what we're doing is a waste. Thinking of thinking thinks of itself, which means it thinks up and bears more thoughts. Doesn't bear a self, it thinks of itself. So what does it bear? Thoughts. That's mentally obsessive thinking. Thoughts thinking of themselves think about themselves by creating more thoughts. Again, a thought thinking of itself is true and real, so ends up entertaining more thoughts about themselves, so that becomes the creator of reality and more thinking. Does not create truth and reality, despite the conclusions that since we are consumed with our thoughts, it's all that's happening. That's a very narrow view, making believe that the limits of our thinking actually define reality and truth, when in fact the limits of any thought that is limited is being defended and fought for as truth and reality and represents the beginning of everything else, rather than the end of anything. Just like the horizon The horizon could never be approached. You can approach it, it can never be realized. You can realize the point at which it was before you started moving toward it, but as you move toward it, it moves in the same distance. If you're at sea, it's the distance from sea level is set. I don't know what it is right off the top of my head. But the horizon will always move forward, and everything that it used to seemingly hide becomes revealed as we move toward it. And that movement is the natural state of our inspired awareness. It's both stable and also current. If you think of these words, still means not moving, still means still present. Current means now. Current means some sort of fluidity, some sort of movement. And it isn't that we're moving, it's moving through us. It is our process that we are experiencing and creating that seems to be moving us, but it's actually moved by us. So we are the movers and we are the shakers because we are the choosers and we are the doers in terms of our experience. If we are willing to allow our thinking to begin contemplating reality and truth as its basis, our thinking will get much better quicker than making believe we need to get somewhere to finally resolve something that is a problem we keep creating by making believe it isn't where we are right now. And I will assure you all that the present state of our being as a species and every inanimate object is present right now. We are with it. It is not happening somewhere else. It is happening in relation to exactly where we are, because the sum total of everything happening is our present state right now. And the beauty of that is that the sum total of everything that's ever happened, that's actually happened, is also the culmination of this present moment. If somebody put a footprint on a sandy beach somewhere and the wind has not blown and no one else has stepped on it, it is sitting there right now. We do not need to think it's there for it to be there. We do not need to think of anything to consider everything and start to unify our thinking and each other in an inclusive contemplation that is awakened because we can sit with our eyes open and meditate, since our natural state is an awakened meditation. We are naturally observing everything. We are naturally witnessing everything. We are naturally aligned with all that is. What we choose to do with it are choices that we make. How we choose to veer from and pervert things are things we choose to do. We are no more bound by them than the ideas we have that give us the impression that they're the only things we can do. Again, those are choices we make. Creating impressions becomes depressing after they're maintained for a while. Thoughts are always changing. To think it's who we are is to commit to never having any stable experience about ourselves. It's just a constant changing tide of thoughts that cannot stand still, since they're always on the run, always moving, trying to escape the contempt created in the idea that false parading as truth will ever become reality and true. This is very, very simple. It is very precise. It is very exact, not because I say so, but because the reality of reality is real and the truth of truth is true. And honesty is honest and hope is hope. And if we have spent our lives hoping for hopeless things and having faith in faithless things and having courage in things that we cannot ever overcome, then we have been misutilizing, and underestimating our own capacity by living down to the least hopeful, faithful things and making believe we need to overcome them when they're all simply concepts and thought. If we have faith in anything faithful, our actions will act accordingly very quickly, and we will immediately have results that will reaffirm the faith and eliminate any need for it, because we will know that we know what faithfulness is. These principles are guides for humans to begin to start noticing that our nature is not human, but actually a being nature, a knowing nature. It's the essence of essence, and essence is essential. It is not optional. Again, the absolute revealing itself. It's something that does not come or go when we think it isn't here. To talk about this publicly and openly allows for that knowing nature to start to become obvious, because things will start occurring to you that you don't understand and you will think you need to grasp and hold on to. But ultimately, you'll begin to notice that we are already held by that, and we aren't even held by that because as a loving source, it doesn't condemn us to being held, but yet we cannot be condemned by being given everything that there is by a source that is unlimited. There is no condemnation in having everything and not having any choice over everything, because we have everything. Normally, a lack of choice infers some loss of something. There is no loss in everything. There is no chance to lose it. These are all delusional ideas we create in our own experience based on the thinking we're doing about reality and truth. It's not reality and truth that we're thinking about. It's the thinking about it, just like it's the thinking about each other that tends to conflict our relationships. It's not who people are. If their essence is like my essence and like your essence, then our essence is the same. And if it's absolute, then it's absolutely the same all the time. And to think of people other than that as a primary basis for our opinions is to see them as they are not and not see them at all, and then hear them say to us, you don't see me, you don't listen to me. And they are right. We may not like hearing it because we think what we're thinking is truth and reality, and it shatters our ideas about truth and reality and seems to threaten our life to have other people think differently than we do, when in fact, life is not born of thought. Thought is born of life. Thought is born to express life. Thought is born to express principles like reality and truth, whatever that they mean, in the fullest level of expression. In totality, not in some bits and pieces, because we're these frail, pitiful creatures searching for water and food. There's plenty of water and plenty of food, and we live on a planet where people are starving to death and drinking poisoned water. That is some evidence that we don't mind ignoring what's happening in the name of thinking we're better off. And I would say that's a very perverted version of reality and truth. If I have to use other people's peril to feel better, I'm obviously feeling very at risk with my own sense of peril. And when all I've done is reduce myself to what I think, I am in great peril, because my thinking is never going to stop changing, and it's never going to come to any conclusion. And it's always going to conclude it is right in the name of being wrong, out of the desperation that seems to compel this kind of thinking forward, just like drug abuse and all the other addictions seem to require us to continue doing the thing that everyone recognizes is killing us while we think it's saving us. I appreciate you being here, and I appreciate that we are all here together right now. And to begin to consider that is to begin to notice that we are actually absolutely part of it all. Actualization and realization doesn't have to be self-actualization and self-realization and self-love to actually realize in our experience what's happening. We have been the choosers of these thoughts the whole time. We have been the ones submitting our experience to the owner's manual of consequence and occurrence and situation and circumstance. All of those things that are reflected in the actions we take are all guidance systems to how well we're doing with what we're thinking. And if we're suffering in the experience we're having, we're thinking thoughts that are suffered, that we're suffering thoughts that are not true. It's very simple. If you're disturbed, you're thinking about something that is not true, and you're maintaining it in the name of thinking someday it will be. The longer you think about it, the harder you think about it, then life seems hard and life seems complicated, when it is the complications of the hardening of your own arteries and thoughts that you are struggling with, and that we all struggle with whenever we perpetuate that thinking. It's natural consequence because it's the natural order of things. It's literally our owner's manual, like you get with a car, saying, if the window's broken, check the fuse. It's giving us indications of things to do. If we're listening, we're guided. If we're fighting it, we're thinking our own guidance is going to prevail. It never will in that regard. And the natural order of things has always been natural for billions of years. And to concede it is to begin to live with it at peace and see that the nature of existence is peaceful and still and current, present, always. It's always in reach, always accessible, because it's always where we are. It's always the essence of our life form, our existence as humans, collectively, not just individually. There is no division in this whatsoever. There is no inequity whatsoever. There is no discrimination whatsoever. There is no distinguishing characteristics whatsoever in the nature of an absolute state of being. None. If that's our premise, if that's our basis, if that's our essence, and we begin to just contemplate it in the least bit, the awareness of it will be automatic, because that little sand grain of faith, of hope, will be relying in things that are faithful and hopeful because they are true and because they are real and because they are immutable, indivisible, and inviolable. I appreciate you listening. Glad we're together in this.